Thank you everyone for being here. Excuse me, so early on a Monday morning. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank the organizers for putting together this really wonderful workshop. It's a great space to be able to gather together and get to know one another, talk about research. And so in the spirit of this workshop, the organizers have asked me to give a talk that's part research talk, part sort of like lessons, learnings. And so I've titled this talk, Market Design in the Social Sector, Lessons from School Choice. And my intention is to kind of sprinkle, especially the earlier parts of the talk, with some like ruminations, takeaways, especially about applied research, how to identify questions in applied research, how to start applied collaborations. And I'm gonna also have some time for you to like talk with each other. And then the second half of the talk is more like a regular research talk. I've given this talk before, so I'm happy to kind of zoom through those, make sure that we have time for the more interactive discussion based part at the beginning. So before I start talking about the specific research project, I just wanted to give you all a brief introduction to my research, which is in the area of market design. You've probably heard of market design. For those of you who haven't, and also for those of you who have, here's how I like to think about it. I like to think about a market as a place where there are things and people who need things. In market design, asks how we set the rules of the place where things are assigned, traded, allocated, so that the right things go to the people who need them most. And since we're thinking about them in the context of markets, it's very natural to bring in techniques from economics, like markets, well, economics is about markets, but also particular competitive equilibria, game theory, incentives. And then since we're thinking about allocation, it's also natural to bring in tools from computer science and operations research. I think about resource allocation, and I do a lot of matching as one particular kind of market. Now, my research focuses on market design in the social sector. And so I looked at applications such as school choice in the developing world, donations and volunteers, and sustainability. And these little images up here, except the ones that are blurred out, are all organizations I've worked with. And so I wanted to start out just by saying a little bit about my general research approach. Like, how did I identify this intersection? How do I identify these organizations to work with? And so my approach, I'm not saying this has to be your approach, but my approach to identifying impactful research questions is the following. I try to ask, where is there the highest overlap between my expertise and applied needs? Okay, let me kind of dig into this a little bit. First, when I talk about expertise, we actually all have a lot of different kinds of expertise. And there's two kinds that I like to distinguish: research expertise and domain expertise. Okay, let me give you a few examples of these. So first, research expertise. My research expertise might be disciplinary, right? So I'm trained in operations research. That's where I got my PhD. I also did a postdoc in economics, and I took a bunch of classes there. And so I would say I have, some disciplinary expertise in economics. But then when we think about expertise, there's also methodological, right? Like, what are the kinds of research problems that I like to solve? And for me, I identified very early on that the kind of math I really like is discrete math. Okay, so I try to look for problems with discrete math, not exclusively, right? One of my first kind of more market design papers was taking this algorithm called top trading cycles, which is like a very beautiful discrete combinatorial algorithm, and then describing it in a continuum framework where we turned it into differential equations. And I like saying to Jacob, we took like this beautiful algorithm and we turned it into differential equations, which are my least favorite kind of stuff. So there's some, mapping between my methodological expertise and my research, but not exactly. And then I also like to think of myself as having some expertise in modeling, thinking about how to translate from the real world to math and vice versa, and also algorithms. But then on top of research expertise, we all bring domain expertise, right? And so for me, I've spent many years thinking on problems in the education context. So that's just one that I've built up over time. But you can also think like, well, what are the topics that you're just interested in, right? What do you read about in your spare time? What do you follow? Where are you aware of, the latest developments? And in addition, all of us bring our lived experience For me, I grew up fairly privileged overall. So I am female, and so I did grow up in a lot of spaces where I was, one of a few women in the room. That's something that I do bring as part of my lived experience, but all of us bring lots of other things. And I think that lived experience allows us to identify a lot of underexplored issues and say there needs to be research to answer these questions. Okay, so first that's expertise. And then the second part is, where's there overlap between my expertise and applied needs? And here I would just encourage you to sit down again, think about what are the topics that I'm interested in, where I think there are big problems, right? And just list them out, right? So I sit down with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and kind of look at the ones that really speak to me. Here are a few that I sort of collected. So educational equality, segregation, development, particularly poverty and hunger, sustainability, climate change, clean energy, healthcare, health disparities, a lot of waste in healthcare. It's just a small list. I'm obviously not working on all of these, and obviously no one person here can work on all of these, and also obviously no one research project is going to solve any of these. But I think this is a helpful way to start narrowing in on, okay, where do these things overlap and intersect? And I'm hoping that I can show you through some examples from my own work how I've done this more specifically at a more narrower scope in the context of shipments. So I actually wanted to pause a little bit here and give us some time to turn to our neighbor and share. Let's start with the first half of this overlap. Where do you think is your research and domain expertise? So turn to your neighbor, share. What is your research? Oh, and if you don't know each other, just introduce yourself. What's your name? If you're not staying here, someone feel free to swim around. I'm like very about to change. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I like thinking about it as a section. Yeah. I think the main exercise
Money markets. With money markets.
You look so pretty. Awesome. Yes.
I have this down pat on the job.
Next person had to share their expertise. We'll start maybe social choice or information, but I feel like quickly. I would like okay, doing it.
Dynamic modeling.
Okay, now let's switch to talking about applied. What are the kinds of applications that you find just really compelling? You're always interested in what's happening in them, and they don't have to be things that you're currently doing research on. Just tell other people in your group about them.
Yeah. Especially, yeah. I mean, especially how
yeah. Electric spark is renewable energy transition.
Yeah.
All of the deep stuff. It's forecasting.
What are the needs of like people money?
You know, I was not the one who wanted to pursue that. I was asked to do that project. And, yeah. So. Yeah.
It's like very personal.
They're so, let me give you my business card.
Oh,
It's, oh my, I could spend hours and hours talking about. You know, the one really good.
From their group, what was one thing on the right hand side in these applied needs that came up in your group? You want to share? Yes.
We were both interested in different parts of the healthcare system, like either insurance or the sort of medical treatment stuff.
Healthcare, good. Anyone else? I saw a hand here.
I think I'm the only one of the three who does anything applied, and I work on electricity markets and the renewable energy transition.
One thing I was thinking is, like taking your great model, if you're more theoretical, one could imagine replacing applied need with like unsolved problems in my theory domain, right? And you could still do the same thing.
Definitely, yeah. And I bring this up, as I said, this is my approach because I am more of an applied modeling kind of person. Yeah, great.
One thing we were wondering is kind of like as younger students who are kind of like working to build expertise in these areas, I feel like maybe the applied needs that we're interested in would dictate kind of like the areas where we try to build expertise.
Yeah.
But just like any of your thoughts on that, like approaching that when we don't really feel like, oh, we already have these set like types of expertise.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's kind of why I encouraged you when we were thinking about applied needs, just to think about like, what are the problems that really matter to you, that you care about, that you don't necessarily need to be already doing research in, right? One of the points that I'll kind of unwrap as we go throughout the talk is that doing this kind of applied research takes years. It takes a lot of time. And so there's no rush to kind of jump into something exactly in the middle of this overlap as we're starting out, right? I think because I do a lot of applied work, a lot of students who want to do applied work come to me. And one of the common approaches that I see students wanting to take is, oh, here is this one application I really want to work on. In this application, here is this one specific problem, which I think is like really important. And if I take like my tools that I know and then kind of twist them like this, it kind of fits this problem, right? Can I work on this problem? And I would say usually it's really important to find something that matches both. Right. And so I would normally actually, when you're first starting out, start with the disciplinary expertise, the research expertise, ask what's something in this application that kind of, these are like the right tools for this specific problem. It may not be the most pressing problem, but it allows me to develop my ability to connect between the research world and the practical world. Before then trying to, you're like, as you're doing each problem, building both of these circles up, right? And so that's how I would normally advise starting out a project. And so it's also tempting to, as you mentioned, think about, okay, what are the tools that I really need to know to solve this problem, which is really important to me, right? That's very valid. It is a reasonable approach. If the tools that are needed for that problem end up being a good match for what you're naturally able to do, right? I think everyone sort of has a set of ways of like thinking about research, trying to solve really deep, difficult problems that comes more naturally to you, right? Like for me, I really like discrete math and I really don't like, real analysis, right? So if I like leave my head when trying to do something that requires a lot of real analysis, it's going to be very sort of slow, painful work, which is compounded by the fact that applied work is also kind of slow and painful at times. And so that's why I like the path there, but prediction. Okay, so let's dive into what this has looked like in the context of school choice. What I'm going to tell you about is this is like fairly old work now on some stuff that we did with the San Francisco School District on redesigning their student assignment policy. So some of you have already seen this, but I'm hopefully gonna draw out some additional practical insights that we've learned from this experience. As part of this work, we helped the Board of Education decide on a new policy for student assignment that was approved in 2020. And we're currently in what we call the implementation phase. So there's a lot of new and exciting things that are coming out there. And if we have time, I'm gonna just point to a few questions on equity and school choice that we've identified by working very closely with the district that I think point to broader questions about equity and market design. So we're gonna try to go fairly quickly through the research part so that we can get to these questions at the end. So what is the background for today's problem that we're trying to address? Again, we started out with education, and zooming in a little bit, one of the still very big problems within education is that schools across the United States are resegregating. Okay? So they're not just segregating, they're resegregating. What do I mean by this? If we look at this left-hand plot, this is showing the percentage of Black students in states in the west of the United States. So this particular article divided up the United States into 5 geographic regions. And within the Western states, it looked at the percentage of Black students who attend schools that are 90 to 100% minority. Just one cut of the data, but you can see that, oops, wow, okay. You'll see that this percentage has been decreasing to about the 80s and then starting to. Similarly, if we zoom in on one particular school district, and this is a very different cut of the data, I'm looking at the percentage of schools within this school district. This is the San Francisco Unified School District, which I'm abbreviating SFUSD for short. Here I'm looking at the schools with at least one racial group comprising greater than 45%, right? So you can think of this as some measure of racial concentration. Then again, this proportion is decreasing since school segregation was first ruled unconstitutional, okay, till about the 80s, and then jumping up significantly again. So this is just 2 illustrative data points showing that schools are resegregating, and there's lots of different ways that we can measure this that all tell the same story. And in particular, one district that is facing this problem is the San Francisco Unified School District, or SFUSD. I have a picture of the school district here for you. And San Francisco has been faced with issues of segregated schools for quite a long time. And in fact, right now, they currently use a school choice system with all of its deferred acceptance and matching algorithms to try to address segregated schools. The idea is that if you give people choice across all of the schools in the district, then maybe they don't have to just go to the school that they live close to, and then we can disentangle neighborhood and school segregation. Okay, just to show you visually what the neighborhood segregation looks like in San Francisco, here is a dot map from the 2010 census that shows the race and ethnicity of families who live in the district. And you can see sort of clear geographic patterns. One that I like to point out is that the Black families, they comprise just 5 to 6% of the school-going population. You can see they're super concentrated in the southeast of the district. Okay, and so motivated by school segregation, as well as a bunch of other issues with this choice-based system, in December 2018, the San Francisco Board of Education initiated a redesign of their elementary student assignment system. And the goals of this redesign were to promote diversity, predictability, so families have a good sense of where their children can go to school, proximity, so that people don't have to be traveling all the way across the district, especially against their will, and all with what they call a lens of equity of access. Okay, and so in 2018, they put forward this resolution. Early 2019, or maybe it was 2018, Itai Schlagi, my collaborator, said, oh, look at this. There's this resolution. This district is going to be redesigning their student assignment system. Maybe we should think about collaborating. Okay, so this brings me to my next sort of set of takeaways of how do you decide when you want to collaborate with a practitioner or non-academic. So before I jump into my lessons, who here has tried to start an applied collaboration? Or successfully started an applied collaboration? Okay. You can feel free to raise your hand, even if you've tried. I tried a bunch of random things when I was a PhD student. Most of them didn't pan out. But I think that's part of the process, right? Just like learning to talk to someone who doesn't usually do research about what research is and how it might be helpful. What was that, a question?
No, I wasn't sure on the term, so I was wishy-washy.
Okay, but now you're like, okay, me, I tried to do the collaboration. Very nice. Okay, so here are some questions that I like to ask before starting or even deciding whether to maintain a collaboration. Is there overlap between my expertise and the practitioner needs? So this is very much paralleling the question that I asked before for my research approach. But then just going a little bit deeper in terms of the practicality of the collaboration. Are our research and practical goals aligned? Okay, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but usually when you have a collaboration, you're both looking for something a little bit different out of the collaboration, right? You're looking for a research project, you're looking for this next one, a research question rather than just a consulting project, right? And so there's this hope usually that you need to be able to say something novel from an academic perspective in order to make significant progress. And I would say most practitioners I talk to, 90% of what they want can be done just by using like best practices that already know maybe from like literature like 20 to 30 years ago, right? And so that would fall into something that I would call more of a consulting project. And while these projects are good and helpful and a great service, it is important to distinguish that these are different kinds of collaborations. And right, so that's my research goal. And then they also have these practical goals. And so when you think about what drives a practical goal, especially when working with a nonprofit or a government entity, these goals are very much, usually if you look at what are their policies that they're trying to decide on, or their key sort of strategic initiatives, that's basically all they have the bandwidth to be thinking about, right? And so if you really want to work on something that's really relevant to the organization, but is not one of these top line goals, probably whoever is on their side is not going to have a lot of time to think about it with you or to implement anything in practice. Okay, so in our case with San Francisco, we saw that the practical goal was definitely to redesign their student assignment. And so we went in and we attended a bunch of the board meetings about this particular policy redesign to identify, okay, are we going to be helpful? Is the emphasis more on designing the school choice, the mechanism design part of things, or is it more questions that are sort of outside of our area of expertise? And so we went to a bunch of these meetings, ascertained that, okay, it looks like there's enough overlap with our research expertise that it's worth making the connection. And so that's when we decided to introduce ourselves. It was after attending a few meetings first. Next question you might ask is, are our timelines aligned? And so if you've ever done any applied work, you'll know that research and applied work on very, very different timelines. I'll get a little bit more into what the timeline looks like for this project in a couple of slides, but basically applied work is, especially in industry, usually like super fast, right? You're moving much faster than you would typically want to move in order to deeply understand things from a research perspective. And so you kind of want to ask yourself, are they okay with me taking a little bit longer in order to understand things to a level where I feel comfortable saying something? You know, when they say the Stanford professor said X, Y, Z, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Like, I need to have thought about this before you can say that this is what I think about it. And so I'll say a little bit more about how we made this work in our case a little bit later. And then finally, I just wanted to point out that it's also important to think about, especially when working with nonprofit, government, local government, is there institutional or administrative support for the project, right? In particular, if you're going to be working with sensitive data, are there data use agreements, best practices, people who can support that connection for you? Often when you're working with a nonprofit, they don't really know, they're just like, oh, here, take my data. But if you're working on a sensitive problem, you want to go through the best practices, go through IRB, and so just make sure that you're aware of all this additional logistical overhead that is necessary to make sure that you're using the proper process when working on these applied problems. And then also, there's a bunch of other administrative stuff that just comes up that you might not think it would. Like, for example, getting approval for any of your applications, anything that you make public. Especially if you're privy to a lot of closed door discussions, then being aware of what you can and cannot say, and being on the same page about that early on in the collaboration. I wanted to briefly highlight a few more things to be aware of before starting a collaboration that I wish I knew when I was a student. So first, take your time to find someone to collaborate with. I think it was very exciting when I was a PhD student, and I found it was, I think, a mentorship matching organization. And I was like, oh, this is like so aligned with like, it's matching, it's education, they really want to work with me. I was like, okay, cool, I really got to make a project happen here. And in the end, the project didn't really pan out. We had a couple of really good conversations, but it was just this problem of going back to my previous questions. I had trouble identifying the right research question that was interesting to me, but also interesting to them, right? And so connected to that are that collaborations and organizations evolve, so that connections that don't pan out now may become useful collaborators later. Maybe something that is their focus now is not that interesting to you, but 2 years down the line, they have a new focus that you're like, okay, my research expertise could be helpful here. And also collaborations become easier, right? As you become more senior, as you become more experienced, more people come to you. And so I think there's no rush to jump into collaborations. You don't have to feel like, oh, the first one that I really connected with, I really have to make this work. In addition, there's no rush because collaborations take a lot of work, right? You're taking time to build trust, build a relationship. A big thing about collaborating with people is learning how to speak a new language, right? You're trying to speak the language, non-academic language of the folks that you're working with. So for me, it's sort of more like education policy language. How do they talk about things in the policy space, just with families? And then learning to translate your own technical concepts for these audiences. And so because it is a lot of work, it is quite risky as well. I really feel like there's no rush to kind of jump in to the first collaboration that you identify. And so just to give you a little bit of a sense of my process, typically I like to do a bit of a funnel. If I have a particular research project or area that I'm trying to get into, maybe send out 10 to 15 cold emails, hopefully score 3 to 4 initial meetings. And of all that, I'll be very lucky and feel very successful if I get one sort of tentative collaboration out of that, right? So there's really like a lot of contact that goes into starting from scratch a successful collaboration. And in those 3 to 4 initial meetings, really setting expectations. What kinds of problems can you solve? I think when you start talking to a like group, they're like, oh wow, you have all this expertise. Here are all our problems that we think you can help us address. And so you can sit down, listen carefully, and be like, oh, these are really interesting problems. That here are the things that people in my discipline already know how to do. So this is kind of more consulting work. Here are things that people in my discipline could help you think about further. And then here are these other things which are your main problems, which I actually think these other disciplines are better equipped to help you address. And then finally, another part of my process is I really believe in end-to-end collaboration with the collaborators and practitioners. So defining the problems together, running research problems sort of through this iterative process where I'm like, okay, I think listening to you, here's how we would phrase the research problem. Like, what do you think about that? And then also co-designing the solution. Okay. So with all of that, let me jump into what we did with the San Francisco School District. So currently in San Francisco, there are about 3,000 to 5,000 incoming kindergarten students every year. 5,000 was pre-COVID, it's kind of dipped to like 3,000 to 4,000 now. And they apply to, depending on how you count, about 70 general education programs, about 50 different schools, or about 150 different kinds of programs altogether, about 70 different schools. Families can rank any number of programs, as I mentioned. If we're looking at general education, language, and special education, there are about 150 different programs. And students have priorities at schools based on if they have a sibling at the school, if they have this special C-1 status, which is basically they live in these dark green blocks, which are the ones that has historically low test scores. And so the idea is to give a boost to students who live in historically academically underserved areas. Then there's also neighborhood priority, and these are just kind of course priorities. So all remaining ties are broken using random lotteries, and they use multiple tiebreakers. The algorithm that's used in San Francisco since 2011, they've been using school choice. And they've been using a kind of version of deferred acceptance, which they follow by these training cycles. We took a bit of a look at their CEDAR code, and we're like, this thing is neither deferred acceptance nor top training cycles, and it's also not strategy proof. And so we kind of rehashed, here's deferred acceptance, here's top training cycles, here's why you might like strategy proofness. And after a bunch of discussions, they decided to use deferred acceptance. So they've been using that since 2019. Something that we also noticed that they do is there's 150 different programs. Deferred acceptance and top training cycles assume that you rank order list all 150 of them. Nobody does. And so there are a lot of people who don't get assigned to something that's on their list of programs. They're listing, 5 to 7 programs. And so if you're not assigned to a program that you've ranked, right now they're what they call designated, using random zero dictatorship to your closest available. And so what were the effects of this system? On the left here, I'm showing you a map from the 1930s of redlining. This is the practice where families living in the red blocks were systematically denied access to resources such as mortgages and loans. And I'm showing you on the right, 2018 map of socioeconomic segregation as measured by student eligibility for free or reduced price lunch. I'm actually showing you this 2 different ways. On the background heat map, I'm showing you the percentage of students who live in each of these areas who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And then the red dots are the 50% of schools with the highest percentage of students attending the school who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. You see a bunch of different patterns, right? Like the dark areas of the heat map on the right basically map onto the red line areas on the left. And so sort of this systemic entrenched segregation, which has persisted through many, many years, almost 100 years. And you can see that reflected in the schools, even though since 2011, San Francisco has been using a choice system, which was meant to help disentangle neighborhood and school segregation. So this is one of the challenges they were trying to address, diversity or lack of in the schools. As I mentioned earlier, they were also trying to address predictability and proximity. There's a sense that choice is very complicated when you're trying to list 150 programs, rank order them, that's just a lot. So a lot of families submit incomplete or short preference lists. And I mentioned this designation process before, where you're assigned using random zero dictatorship to your closest program that you didn't list. About 10% of families are designated. So it's a 1 in 10 chance that you're just randomly assigned somewhere that you didn't even list. And many of these families and other families are actually traveling quite far across the district. In addition, we also look at measures of parental satisfaction. One measure is how many parents participate in choice, but then opt out and go to private or charter school instead. And San Francisco has one of the highest rates of opt out across the country. Nearly 20% of families who participate in the choice process opt out and they don't enroll in a public school. And so because of this, in 2018, the board resolved to redesign their student assignment to improve diversity, predictability, proximity with a lens of equity of access. The two policies that they were kind of considering first are the ones that usually come up first in the public policy discussion. There's neighborhood assignment, which is probably one that most of us grew up with, which is you just go to your neighborhood school. The problem with neighborhood assignment is that because the neighborhoods are segregated, the schools are also going to be segregated. Since 2018, the districts have been using school choice, where you can choose from any of the 150 programs in the district. And they saw that it hadn't been achieving any of their goals. It's not diverse, not predictable, not proximate, and not equitable. And so they said, well, if these two common approaches are not working, maybe we can try to address some of the challenges, right? That the neighborhood assignment is facing the problem of residential segregation. The neighborhoods are too segregated. District-wide choice is facing the challenge of choice-driven segregation. And so maybe we can kind of try to address both of these using these policy concepts. This was their thinking. I don't know how all the logical steps tie together. But they were thinking, okay, maybe we could use initial neighborhood assignment with optional district-wide choice. Maybe this would help. We did some initial simulations that showed it just didn't do very much. So I'm not going to tell you about this concept 1. But concepts 2 and 3, the idea was to restrict choice to small or medium-sized geographic zones. And you can see that this would definitely help with predictability if you're guaranteed a school in your zone, definitely help with proximity. The zones are small enough that you're not going too far. And the question is whether we can put in some controls to help also with diversity. And so this is what our collaboration with the district looked like. Going back to the question of timeline, how do you align the research and practical timelines? In 2018, they put forward this board resolution. And so we worked with them from May 2019 to December 2020 on coming up with this policy decision that they made in December of 2020. And so that's going to be the main focus of the next like 5 minutes of talk. This was actually a paper that we published here at EC, and we published the extended abstract here at EC in 2022. So you can see there's quite already a delay in the timeline here, right? We did a lot of the work very quickly over the course of about a year and a bit, from 2019 to 2020. We're moving much faster than we were comfortable from a research perspective, but they had this policy timeline, right? And so you'll see the work itself, there are a lot of steps of it that are quite heuristic. And so the first thing we have to do is go back and just sort of dot our I's and cross our T's and all of that heuristic work. And that's the result. The results of that are what are published in the 2022 paper. But then on top of that, this is just the contours of the policy. What does the policy look like at a high level? And so between 2020 and 2026, they actually have to decide on all the details of the policy. Actually, between 2020 and 2025, they have to decide on all the details of the policy, because 2025 is when families are going to be applying to schools under this new policy. And so we're in now what they call a policy implementation phase. I'll tell you in a moment that the policy they decided on was to use zones. Okay, and so some of the decisions that need to be made are like, well, what exact zones? Right? There's a bunch of decisions, but that one seems pretty important, and that's one of the problems that we've been working on. And so since this initial policy decision, we have an ongoing collaboration with them that we've been housing in our Stanford Impact Lab on equitable access to education. And we have a bunch more research papers that are coming out of that, as well as a lot of class projects, RAUs, research experiences for undergrads, so on, that we're using to kind of help cover all parts of that spectrum, right? The parts that are a little bit more consulting, we can turn into a class project for some students. The parts that are research, we can turn them to these sort of longer timeline research papers. I'm not advocating that you guys as students go out and do research in this way. I just wanted to give you one example of what is possible within academia and how we can bridge between like all these different timelines, all these different roles. I'm still kind of working this out myself, but just wanted to offer that this is kind of how I think about all the different pieces of our collaboration. Okay, so I'm gonna fly through these next few slides because I really want to get to telling you about some of the new directions I think we can explore. But here's what we already did. First, important to try to desegregate schools. There's a lot of literature in education policy showing why. Let me not go into the details. And we also all already know the mechanism design approach, which is let's just let people report their rank ordered preferences, and then we'll take these preferences, design a strategy-proof algorithm to assign students to schools to achieve certain objectives like stability or efficiency. So this is sort of the typical approach. What I'm going to draw from this approach are a couple of things. First, which mechanism should we use? And then second, how do we guide the mechanism? Okay, this question has actually been a little less studied in the mechanism design literature, in the matching literature, right? If we're trying to achieve diversity, right? How should you do that in school choice? And the papers that look at this will mostly say, let's just reserve seats. Okay, we're going to set aside seats for students from certain disadvantaged groups or advantaged groups to try to balance out the populations of students in each school. And so there are a couple of these tools that have been suggested, right? We can just use priorities to guide everything. We can use menus or restrict the choice set available to students, or we can use reserves. And what we're going to do in this work is we're just going to take these tools that are already suggested in the literature and not really studied too much in the literature, and just heuristically apply them and see how well each of them work in our context. Okay. And so I'm going to skip over these initial considerations and just tell you about the policies that we considered. The first policy we considered was zones. We're going to restrict choice using geographic zones. This was what the district wanted to do, because what they wanted to do within this little yellow box. Okay. Yellow is what the district wanted to do. On top of that, we said, well, if you want to achieve diversity, just restricting to zones is not going to do anything. Right? You want the zones to be big enough so that they're residentially diverse, but then on top of that, you need to do some controlling. So I'm going to add an extra lever. And so the school choice literature says you should use reserves. So particular soft reserves mean that if there are not enough students from the group who want those seats, other students can take those seats. In addition, we also looked at a home-based plan. This is similar to what Boston Public Schools has done with the work of Peng Shi. This is using a more optimized based approach. And then finally, we also looked at priorities, which is what the school choice literature would usually say to do. Just use priority to try to achieve any distributional goal. Right? And so we hacked together some priorities that we're trying to really improve on diversity. We're going to see how those perform. Okay. So now that we have these policies, the next thing we have to do is decide, well, what zones are we going to use? Okay, and so we took an optimization approach where we're going to build zones from building blocks. And we're going to use math programming to put these zones together. And the math programs are going to satisfy a bunch of different constraints. There are shape constraints, if it's going to be contiguous or non-contiguous. There are size constraints. You can set the number of zones that you want to have, or the number of schools per zone. And then there are balance constraints, balancing students across zones, seats and students within zones, so that there's not too many seats or too many students, also demographics and school performance or popularity. So there's not kind of like the really good school zone and the really nobody wants to go to these school zone. Okay, let me not show you these constraints, except to say that we took a lot of these from the existing literature on neighborhood school assignment and also political redistricting. And so the work that we did in this original paper was really high level, right? Proof of concept. We use these very large building blocks, about 50 building blocks. And you can see on the left here, the zones that I'm going to show you the results for. Okay, and you can see that these these zones are using really large building blocks, and so because of that, in order to be diverse, they're really kind of like a little long, right? They're trying to cut across this diagonal. And so these are not actually going to be tenable zones, but they were more used as a proof of concept, that zones as a concept could be big enough to help with diversity, but then with the controls could also guard against choice-driven resegregation. And so in follow-up work, what we've been doing as part of policy implementation is to try to find close to final zone boundaries using much smaller building blocks. So about 5,000 building blocks instead of 50. And so when you do that, you get a really computationally hard problem that starts to look a lot more like political redistricting. And so we have this paper that is coming out very, very soon. We look at a couple of existing methods, recursive methods that are kind of more like multi-level optimization, as well as sampling-based MCMC methods that are kind of the cutting edge of political redistricting right now, showing how all of these approaches work on this slightly different structured problem of multi-school districting. And I'm happy to talk about that offline, but yeah, you can see as a preview what the zones are looking like. If we use the recursive method, we can actually get pretty nice looking zones that are pretty small. And when you have a lot of small zones, it's like an exponential blow up in the size of your map program. If we try to use political redistricting, that's what you see on the right, it's kind of not doing as well. We get these little like tails and misbehaved parts of the map. And so there's a lot of interesting questions there on why it's behaving. Let me skip across this part. The second thing that we did was this left-hand side. Okay, the slides that I just skipped are summarized on the left. Basically, in addition to deciding on the policies and the zones, we also wanted to simulate their effects, right? And so to simulate their effects, we had to predict, well, how do we think people will choose given these policies and zones? And so as I mentioned earlier, we noticed that people don't list everything, right? And so if I'm restricting the set of things that they can list, well, maybe there were schools in that set that they didn't list before because they were trying to pick between 150 schools, but which they will list now. Okay? And so that's the main thing that we were trying to predict. And our approach to it, again, very heuristic. We just took a lot of the existing approaches in the literature. The standard thing to do is to estimate a choice model. That gives you everyone's utility for every school. So like, how would they rank all the schools? But then we also wanted to predict, well, how many of these schools are they going to list? And then we also wanted to predict, are they going to actually enroll in the school, or are they just going to drop out and go to private or charter school? And so those are some of the things that we were trying to predict. And then finally, we also wanted to evaluate. And so we worked with a lot of collaborators over in the education school to try to come up with the appropriate metrics for measuring the performance of these policies. Briefly show you our results. These results are generated using the process that I just showed you, using data from 2018 to 19 is the particular year that we used. Yeah, so we used kindergarten applicants to the 2018-19 school year, but then we estimate the choice models using 5 years of historical choice data, 2014 through 2019. And we've recently redone a lot of this using applicants through the 2023-24 application cycle and using student choice from 2021 to 2024. So more recent data, the high level trade-offs are going to be the same as what I show you today. So what are the trade-offs? Well, first, the policies are in the columns here. We have our home-based policies on the left. We have our zone-based policies in the middle. We have priorities, and then we have the actual assignment in 2018-19 as sort of a benchmark to compare against. I'm going to show you a whole bunch of different numbers here. So each of these rows corresponds to one of these district goals, right? Diversity is just one measure of diversity, the percentage of racial minorities, African American, Latinx, and Pacific Islander in schools with greater than 67% eligibility for free reduced price lunch. You can think of this as like concentration of racial minorities in mid to high poverty schools. Okay. So I want that to be low, right? I want that to be a low percentage of such students who are in these schools. The bottom row is proximity, the average distance from students to their assigned school in miles, bird's eye distance. And then the top row was not a district goal, but we still wanted to look at choice, right? How happy do we think families are going to be with their assigned schools? And so looking at diversity, again, we wanted this number to be low, and we see that using the reserves or the priorities, the typical school choice levers, you can get this percentage all the way down, more than half the way down from the original 29%. So you can really move the needle. Over here, proximity, unsurprisingly, the policies that restrict choice to closer by schools are going to do better in terms of proximity. Okay. What's interesting is that priorities is able to achieve diversity, but it does this by letting some students travel really, really far from where they live. And then finally, if we look at choice, again, unsurprisingly, all these left-hand policies that restrict choice are going to significantly reduce the percentage of families who are assigned to one of their chosen schools. And I think what's interesting here is the magnitude of the change, right? Like how many fewer families are going to be getting one of their choices. There's a lot more things I usually like to tease out from this table, but due to time, I'm going to have to skip across. So happy to talk about this offline. The main thing I wanted to mention is just sort of this like green diagonal that you're seeing, right? There's no one policy that's doing well on all of these goals. There's a trade-off between these four sets of goals. And so the district looked at this and they said, well, this column over here looks great, right? This one seems to be achieving all of our policy goals. I'm happy to talk more about sort of things to be careful about when looking at a table like this. But again, I don't really have time right now, so I'm going to skip across this. And so based on this analysis, in 2020, the district proposed the following policy. They're going to restrict choice to medium-sized geographic zones. They're going to use reserves to try to control choice to make the schools more diverse. And they wanted to add on, they're going to improve outcomes for target populations using equity priorities. So this is similar to the CTEP priorities that I mentioned earlier. And the Board of Education approved the policy in December 2020. For implementation, I need to update this. Implementation starting, when they approved it, it was actually for the 24-25 school year. And then there was a 1-year extension due to COVID, and then another year extension because right now they're deciding on which schools to close. So they need a year to decide on that. And that's a very important input to zones, because if there are some schools closing, then that should affect how zones look as well. A bunch of challenges and considerations and next steps. Again, I'm not going to have time to talk about these, but again, this is a really complex process and there's a lot of things to consider beyond just this like one table. But I did want to spend my final like 2 minutes just highlighting a few questions on equity and market design that I think came out of this work. And the lens that I use to try to think about equity of access and student assignment is going back to the education policy literature and asking, well, how do they think about equity in educational reform? And so their definition of equity of access is the following: that the ways in which educational institutions and policies strive to ensure the removal of any barriers that might prevent some students from equitable participation in certain courses or academic programs. So I was like, okay, how do I take this and make it very particular to school choice? And so here's my slight rejiggling. The ways in which student assignment strives to ensure the removal of any barriers that might prevent some students from equitable enrollment in programs serving their unique. And so if I take this lens, I can look at the entire process of student assignment and ask, what are these barriers, right, to equitable enrollment? And look at, well, when families are forming preferences, right? I already said they have to like just rank order list 150 programs. That seems kind of crazy. And so we might ask, well, does everyone have equitable information about schools? Are they able to form their preferences equally well? And then submitting preferences, does everyone understand how this whole algorithmic assignment process works? Then assignment to schools, this is the one we would probably tend to focus on. If we were to just take the standard school choice approach, like how equitable does the actual assignment look? And then finally, can everyone actually get to their schools? Right? And I'm telling you have the option of going to the school, but is it really practically an option for you that you can't get there? And then finally, since we are talking about redesigning this whole process, there's the question of just procedural justice, right? Do all families feel like they are heard and that their needs are being met in the process of deciding on this policy? I have a bunch of questions that I think are really interesting here. I'm not going to have time to list them all out for you, but I just wanted to say in terms of the first one, I think there's a bunch of things about how we can better provide information in mechanism design, and I'm very happy to see that this is starting to be a very active area. And so how do we do mechanism design when people need to learn their preferences? You don't just come in already knowing them. What are the equity effects of these questions? Can we shift preferences to improve efficiency or equity for the goals? What are the effects of unequal access to information? A lot of interesting questions here on that first piece of information provision. Second piece, this one I think is really understudied. I'm just starting to see more literature looking at how do we look at equitable understanding of these algorithmically driven processes, right? So for example, as I told you earlier, in San Francisco, we saw that small details matter in how you implement a mechanism, right? This thing that looked in the pseudocode at a high level a lot like deferred acceptance or top trading cycles was actually neither. And because of that, it lost a lot of its good properties. But I think there are some broader questions. How interpretable are these different assignment algorithms? Here, I think there's a lot that we can learn from human-computer interaction and the way that they explain things here. You know, Jason has a bunch of things on like dashboard mechanisms and the concepts of mechanism design. Clay and I have some stuff on like menu-based mechanisms for matching. This is just a beginning. I think we're still kind of searching for the right space of mechanisms design here. How much do families understand how to interact with assignment algorithms? And I think there's also a growing set of work looking at the behavioral questions of how are people actually interacting. Is strategy proofness the right normative concept to design for? Again, just really scratching the surface here. Okay, this one is more just like a call to action. Equity and procedural justice. Families have different perceptions about how well school assignment serves their community. So for example, this is taken from one of the community engagement sessions in 2018-19. Families were asked, how likely is each of these concepts, 1, 2, or 3, to meet your family's needs? And I've grouped their responses here by their racial background. And you can see that the Black and Latinx families just basically rated all of them like below 3. Right? And here's a quote from one family. It's always families and communities with fewer resources that get stuck with lower quality schools and less choice. Right? So generally, they were just sort of distrustful of all of these concepts. They felt that none of them were really going to be serving the needs of their community. And so I think that the challenge for all of us is to consider the procedural justice of our algorithms that we're designing and the research that we're doing for these algorithms. And in our case, this is really not my area of expertise, but I feel really strongly that this is important. And so again, this my approach has been to turn this more into like the student project, right? The consulting project. And so we have some undergrads who are doing focus groups and really talking to these families. And we've also brought in a master's student who knows a lot of the principles from human-computer interaction, especially human-centered design, value-sensitive design, to try to put together some of those focus groups and surveys. I think I'm out of time, so I'm just going to flash up this slide and then end. In general, when I think about integrating equity and inclusion into my research, I like to think about this in the context of like 3 questions, right? What research questions am I focusing on? Who does the research? And how do we do the research? Again, I'm not going to have time to talk about each of these in detail, but I just wanted to flag that all of these, I think, are important components of making sure that we're integrating equity and inclusion into our research. I think none of these in isolation is really gonna get us get the job done. Okay, So with that, I will close and thank you to the organizers again and all of you for attending.
Thank you so much for the great talk. Do we have any questions from?
I'm curious, so you talked about modeling how people make decisions, especially if they're deciding to opt out or choosing what to rank. How do you talk a little more about how you thought about that and sort of how robust your solution is to people acting suboptimally in different cases?
Yeah, great question. When we were predicting choice and how people rank and how people opt out, we just took like classic machine learning approaches. We didn't have any sort of safety model, right? So for modeling how they would rank, we just used classic ranked ordered logit, multinomial logit. These are the ones that are typically used in predicting choice in particularly the school choice literature, but also consumer choice, a lot of other choice settings. And there are a lot of interesting papers that show that the pitfalls of this kind of approach. And so we haven't gone ahead to try to use any of those more clever techniques. We have one follow-up paper where we're trying to look at, well, if we're trying to jointly predict both like how much you like things and then how many you're ranking, maybe we should do this prediction problem jointly, and we show, yes, actually it helps a lot with predicting, especially like when you're going lower down your list. The logit approach works really well for predicting like your top choices, but then its performance kind of degrades as we're trying to go lower down in your list. And so that's kind of important for figuring out like families who are not getting what they want, where do they end up? But yeah, generally, I'm not very sort of optimistic about the robustness of our prediction results, particularly for families opting out. This one, like I just keep telling the district over and over, this is not a data analysis problem. Like we don't have the data to predict this well. And so we can give our best guess and like very, very wide confidence intervals and do with that what they will. But I think there's space for a lot more like behavioral approaches or survey-based approaches to complement this data-driven approach.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the part of your presentation where you talked about collaborations, how to set them up, which, well, I'd seen this before, I had not seen that before, and I wish I'd seen it a year earlier. Well, in particular, on one of your slides, you talked about a process where you send out, say, 10 to 15 emails to people, and then some of those get a first meeting out of them, and then some fraction of those, you finally get one collaboration by the end. Or did those numbers come from personal experience where you settled on how many emails to send it originally, and how did you come to those numbers over the years?
Yeah. So those are, guesstimates that I put together based on my own experience. And though that's the process that we're using in terms of scaling our lab to work with more districts. How did I arrive at those? I only have a couple of years ahead of all of you all, so it's not a ton more data points to go off. And so I would say this sort of order of magnitude seems to be what I've observed in my own attempts to collaborate. But ask other faculty who have a history of collaborating with practitioners what their funnel looks like, what those numbers look like. Might also be, I'm sure it differs so much from person to person. Yeah.
Thank you.